For centuries, people regarded elephants as living beasts of burden, strong but mindless giants, designed only to haul timber, wage war, and entertain people in circuses. For thousands of years, elephants silently carried loads and people on their backs, and we never bothered to look into their eyes and ask the simple question, what if behind that calm facade lay a mind as good as our own? Only one event changed our view of these magnificent animals forever. Kenya, 1982. Amboseli National Park. Early morning. The air was still chill from the night, but the sun was beginning to scorch the red African earth. Young American scientist Joyce Ball sat in her battered Jeep, which looked more like a junkyard on wheels than a vehicle. The door was hanging on a single hinge. The windshield was covered in a web of cracks, and the seat was eaten away by countless African insects. In her bag was a letter from the university informing her that her research funding had been cut. The money would only cover 3 months of work, after which she would have to abandon her research and return home empty-handed. Joyce was recording elephant behavior for her dissertation, struggling with doubt and fatigue. At the time, elephants were considered mere intelligent cows, animals that obeyed commands but lacked complex thought or emotions. Her supervisor, Professor Coleman, constantly admonished her in letters. Miss Ball, don't attribute human qualities to animals. Study their behavior rather than imagine their feelings. Science is about facts, not emotional fantasies. Then she heard it, a faint, barely audible hum that seemed to come not from the air, but directly from the ground. The sound was so low, only 12 hertz, while the human ear can detect frequencies as low as 20 hertz, that she felt it in her body more than she heard it. It was like a faint earthquake, the rumble of a distant storm, the breathing of the earth beneath my voice. A sound that penetrated solid rock for dozens of kilometers. Joyce looked up from her notebook and saw him. 50 meters away, a huge elephant stood still, like an ancient statue of black granite. Even among his peers, he stood out for his size, about 4 meters tall, clearly an old bull, weighing almost 6 tons. His left ear was half torn off, a clean wound, the mark of a trap or a spear. On his right flank, blood still oozed from a fresh gash made by a sharp blade. His tusks bore scars from the past, one broken at the base, as if cut by an axe, the other worn by the ravages of time and stained with deep scratches from countless ropes. Truly scars of the war between man and nature, etched on living flesh. But his gaze was the most striking. Compared to his massive body, his eyes were small but incredibly expressive, staring directly into her. It was not the casual gaze of an animal noticing a human. This was not the wary gaze of a wild animal, ready to flee or attack. This was an inquisitive gaze, an assessing gaze, the gaze of a thinking being, trying to understand who was in front of him and whether he could trust this strange, two-legged creature in a metal box. Joyce felt a shiver run down her spine. She had studied animal behavior for 5 years, observing lions in the Serengeti and chimpanzees in the Ugandan forests, but she had never experienced anything like this before. This wasn't a research observation. This was an encounter. Communication between two intelligent beings trying to understand each other across the vast gulf of species difference. The elephant took a slow step forward. His gait was typical of such a surprisingly graceful giant, every movement measured and precise. The ground beneath his feet didn't tremble, even though each foot was the size of a car tire. The soles of his feet acted as perfect shock absorbers, distributing weight so skillfully that the 6-ton behemoth could walk almost silently. He took a few more steps, and he raised his trunk and sniffed. Then he made a sound. Not the trumpeting sound with which elephants usually announce their presence, but a quiet, almost intimate sound. A question. Joyce held her breath. Her instinct urged her to start the engine and take off. A lonely old elephant can be unpredictable, especially when it's injured and angry from confronting brutal poachers. But something stopped her. Perhaps it was scientific curiosity, or perhaps it was her intuition that told her this moment would change not only her life, but humanity's entire understanding of the intelligence of these giants. The elephant simply stood there and stared at her. Joyce sat there and stared at her. Time seemed to stand still in the fragile balance between man and animal, civilization and wilderness, science and mystery. Somewhere deep in the savannah, baboons screamed, and vultures soared high in the sky. But in that narrow space between the jeep and the elephant, there was incredible silence, understanding silence. Then the elephant did something remarkable. He sat down. He simply lowered himself to the ground, the way domesticated dogs do when they want to show they're not a threat. The giant sat in the middle of the savannah and continued to watch her with an expression of almost human curiosity. In the animal world, this behavior is called a playbow, a sign of peaceful intentions. But Joyce didn't know that yet. All she saw was that the predatory giant had willingly made himself vulnerable and showed his trust. At that moment, Joyce realized, before her stood more than just a representative of the African savanna fauna. This was a character, an individual with his own story, his own personality, his own thoughts and feelings, a being who, despite all the wounds inflicted by human, had decided to trust her. She named him Tembo, which simply means elephant in Swahili, a simple name for a superhuman being. At the time, she had no idea that this wounded giant would hold the key to one of our planet's most astonishing mysteries, the secret of animal intelligence. That day, Tembo sat beside the jeep for more than 3 hours. He didn't come closer. He didn't try to escape. He simply stood there. Sometimes he lay on his side, stretching his belly out toward the morning sun like a cat on a windowsill. Sometimes he would stand and slowly walk around the car, examining it from different angles and tilting his head left and right, movement people make when they want to understand something new and interesting. He even lightly touched the rear bumper with his trunk, not pressing, not trying to tip it over, simply exploring. The tip of his trunk functioned like the fingers of a blind person who reads Braille. He touched the metal, the rubber of the tires, even lightly touched the antenna. This was not a chaotic investigation, but a systematic study of an unknown object. Joyce recorded every movement, every sound, every expression in his eyes. By the end of the day, she had compiled 30 pages of notes, more than she had collected in the entire previous week of observations. But the most important discovery couldn't be reduced to numbers or facts. It was a revolution in understanding. Tempo had clearly shown her that the elephant was not a biological machine responding to stimuli according to evolutionary programs, but a thinking being with a rich inner life. As the sun set and the sky flooded with hues of orange and purple, Tempo stood. He looked at Joyce one last time, long and attentively, as if memorizing her face. Then he made the same soft sound he'd made that morning, turned, and walked slowly toward the acacia trees. At the edge of the grove, he stopped, turned, and appeared to wave his trunk. Joyce could have sworn it was goodbye. See you tomorrow. And sure enough, Tembo returned the next day, and the day after that. In the months that followed, he became a constant companion on their search. Sometimes he came alone, sometimes with other elephants, a small group of bachelors, as adult males who had left the herd were called. But even in the group, Tembo stood out, the mate. Other elephants treated him with obvious respect, giving him their place at the waterhole and not arguing with him when he chose the best acacia branches for him to eat. Joyce realized she was witnessing an elephant hierarchy that was more complex than official science had assumed. Tembo wasn't just an old man. He was a leader, a father figure, an elephant whose authority was unquestioned by his fellow elephants. His scars were medals, certificates of countless battles and victories. His quiet confidence testified to his deep understanding of the world in which he lived. However, when Joyce began publishing her first reports of Tempo's behavior, she faced subtle skepticism from the scientific community. Weekly video calls with the university turned into intense interrogations. Professor Coleman, his voice distorted by the poor satellite connection, said, "Miss Ball, you are systematically attributing human motives and emotions to the elephant. This is a common mistake made by novice researchers. Analogy. Science demands objectivity, not romantic fantasies about animal friendships." Joyce objected. "But, Professor, you should have seen how he makes decisions, how he plans his actions, how he reacts differently to different people." Coleman interrupted. "I've observed the behavior of thousands of animals in my career, and they all show one thing. evolutionarily programmed responses to external stimuli. Elephants don't have a well-developed prefrontal cortex, essential for abstract reasoning. Nor do they have mirror neurons, responsible for empathy. These are scientifically established facts, not up for debate. Animals don't think, they react. Her university colleagues began to publicly question Joyce's competence. At a conference on animal behavior, her lecture on the social hierarchy and individual characteristics of elephants was met with laughter. One professor sneered, "Next lecture, elephants reading Shakespeare?" Her research funding was further cut. Her funding was reduced to a minimum. The university wrote her, "Concentrate on male reproductive behavior. Investigate reproductive cycles and territorial disputes, topics of practical value to zoos and captive breeding programs. Your observations on supposed individual characteristics lie outside the scope of serious zoology." Joyce found herself in a difficult position. Her money was running out faster than she had expected. Life on the savannah was expensive, gasoline for the constant commute. Food she had to buy from the nearest town 100 kilometers away, and wages for local assistants and translators. Her colleagues at home were increasingly insinuating that her work was just the whim of a wealthy American woman trying her luck in research. Her family openly urged her to return home. "Joyce, dear," her mother wrote, "you are 27 years old. All your friends are married with children. It's time to give up these childish games with animals and get back to real life." "Mr. Harrison, our neighbor's son, is recently divorced and is interested in you. He's a successful lawyer, with a house in a beautiful area." Joyce seriously considered packing up and returning to America. Maybe they were right. Maybe she had seen something that wasn't there and, in her loneliness and despair, had attributed human qualities to the animals. Maybe Tembo was just a curious elephant, and she was simply a lonely woman who had found in him a substitute for human affection. But then something happened that nearly made her give up on everything. But in the end, it strengthened her resolve and changed her perception of elephants forever. On March 15, 1984, at around 5 a.m., Joyce was awakened by the sound of machine gun fire that seemed to come from about a kilometer away from her camp. Poachers. In recent years, they had become a veritable death squad for African wildlife. The price of ivory on the international black market had risen tenfold in the previous decade, transforming elephant hunting from a traditional activity of local tribes into a high-tech business for international criminal gangs. Modern poachers were armed with Kalashnikov rifles, weapons supplied to various parties in conflicts, Africa's many treasures in abundance. They moved in jeeps, coordinated by radio, and had connections to corrupt officials. They weren't poor farmers killing elephants for food, but professional wildlife poachers. The shooting lasted about half an hour, short bursts punctuated by screams and the sounds of fleeing animals. Joyce lay in her tent, clenching her fists, helpless. She had no weapons, no radio to call for help. The nearest ranger station was 20 kilometers away. By the time they arrived, it was all over. Then there was an eerie silence. Joyce knew what it meant. Somewhere, the elephants had died. Probably the same ones she'd been studying for a year and a half. Maybe Tembo. 2 hours later, when the gunfire finally stopped and the poachers' engines died away in the distance, Joyce shuddered and climbed into her battered jeep and drove to the site of the tragedy. Her heart was beating so loudly she could hear it over the roar of an engine. What if Tembo was dead? What if she never saw those wise, discerning eyes again? What she saw in the small clearing, where only yesterday the family of elephants she knew had been peacefully grazing, shocked her deeply and changed her view of these animals forever. In the middle of the clearing lay the bodies, 4 adult elephants and 1 calf. The poachers had worked with brutal efficiency, snipping off their tusks, hacking off their trunks to sell in the Asian traditional medicine market, and then disappearing, leaving the mutilated bodies to attract swarms of flies and vultures. The air was thick with the stench of blood and incipient decomposition. But Tembo was alive, and what he had done defied all scientific notions about animal behavior under stress. The surviving family members, Tembo and 5 other adult elephants, did not flee, as one might expect from shocked animals facing death. They stayed. And their behavior didn't fit any of the theories about biological stress responses. Tembo stood over the carcass of a young elephant cow. Considering her age, she might have been his daughter or niece. The poachers had turned her beautiful face into a bloodied mask and hacked her tusks off at the base, but Tembo didn't see the mutilated carcass, but the elephant she had been in life. He touched her gently with his trunk, first her forehead, then her ears, and finally the spot where the tusks had grown. His movements were gentle, reverent, full of love, like someone stroking the face of a deceased relative, trying to remember every detail. Tembo made sounds that Joyce still remembered. They hadn't been heard before. They weren't screams of pain or anger explained by stress and adrenaline. They were long, melodic sounds, almost like crying, human crying, sounds of grief, loss, and unbearable sorrow. Then something even more amazing happened. Tembo raised his trunk to the sky and began to sprinkle dust on the dead elephant's carcass. But he didn't do this randomly, as elephants usually do when bathing or protecting themselves from insects. He acted deliberately, first spraying the head, then the body, and finally forming a circle around the dead elephant. It was as if he were performing a ritual, a burial ritual. The other elephants stood silently around him, forming a wide circle. Their heads were bowed, their trunks hung silently. Even the calves, which normally couldn't stand still for a minute, stood quietly, clinging to their mother's legs, as if instinctively grasping the importance of the moment. There was something sad, very human in their posture, in their eyes, in the atmosphere itself. This wasn't just a group of animals reacting to stress. This was a family saying goodbye to a deceased relative. Then the matriarch of the herd approached the carcass, the elephant Joyce had dubbed Grandma. She was about 50 years old, very old for a wild elephant. Her hide hung in deep folds, her tusks were worn almost to the base from constant use, and her movements were slow and cautious. But within the herd, her authority was unquestionable. She made all the important decisions, when to go to the watering hole, where to find food, and how to act in case of danger. The grandmother stood for a long time by the dead elephant cow. It could have been her daughter or granddaughter. Elephant families maintain kinship ties for decades. Then she too began dusting, repeating the ritual initiated by Tembo. All the other family members followed suit. Each elephant approached the carcass, stood by it for a long time, touched it with its trunk, and then participated in the dust-scattering ceremony. Even the calves tried to imitate the adults, awkwardly raising their trunks and sprinkling sand over their dead relative. This wasn't a gut-punch reaction to the smell of death. It was a complex, structured ritual that required an understanding of symbolism, the ability to think abstractly, and a sense of community and tradition. The entire somber ceremony lasted for over an hour. Joyce sat in the jeep, not daring to move for fear of disrupting this sacred process. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't even notice them. She understood that she was witnessing something unusual, behavior that official science deemed impossible for animals. After the ritual was over, the elephants slowly approached the carcass one by one and touched it with their trunks. It was their final goodbye. Each touch lasted several seconds, as if trying to memorize forever the smell, the texture of the skin, the last feeling of closeness to their lost relative. Some of the elephants made soft sounds, not screams, but something like a whisper. Tembo was the last to remain. He stood over the dead elephant long after the others had left. His huge head was bent so low that it almost touched the ground. From time to time, he made soft sounds, not screams, but something deeper, sounds for which there are no words in the human language. Then he raised his head and let out a sound Joyce had never heard before. A deep, long cry, full of indescribable grief. The sound echoed across the savannah, and somewhere in the distance, many kilometers away, more elephants answered him. It was as if the entire elephant world had learned of the tragedy and offered its condolences. "They are grieving," Joyce whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Oh my God, they are grieving just like us. They have farewell rituals. They understand death. They love, they remember, they suffer loss." At that moment, she realized that her mission was not just to study the reproductive behavior of elephants for zoos. Her mission was to prove to the world that these animals possess intelligence, feelings, and a soul. That they deserved our respect and protection, not as natural resources or tourist attractions, but as true brothers in spirit. In the days that followed, Joyce continued to observe the behavior of the surviving elephants. What she saw finally convinced her that she was not dealing with mere animals, but with beings with emotional lives and complex cultural traditions. The elephant family regularly returned to the spot where their relatives had died. They came singly or in groups, standing for long periods by the remains, touching them with their trunks. Some brought twigs and leaves and carefully placed them nearby, the way people place flowers on the graves of their loved ones. Tembo came every day for a whole week. Each visit lasted about an hour, accompanied by the same soft, mournful voices. He stood by the remains, sometimes touching them with his trunk, other times bowing his head in silence. One day, Joyce witnessed a remarkable sight. Another elephant, a large male from a neighboring area unrelated to the deceased, arrived at the site of the tragedy. He sniffed the remains for a long time and then, too, began to scatter dust. It was as if he were expressing his sympathy for the grief of others. This behavior completely contradicted all scientific ideas about animals, as beings guided solely by the instincts of survival and reproduction. What Joyce observed was far more complex, a culture, traditions, and emotional bonds that went beyond mere kinship. These observations became a turning point in Joyce's work. She realized that she wasn't studying behavioral responses, but a true civilization. Elephants had traditions passed down through generations. They had ideas about life and death, family and duty, right and wrong. This was ancient wisdom accumulated over millions of years of evolution. However, to prove it to the scientific community, hard evidence was needed. And once again, Tembo held the key to new discoveries. The first major breakthrough came completely unexpectedly. Joyce noticed a strange behavior in Tembo that she couldn't explain at first. Sometimes, in the middle of the day, he would stop suddenly in the middle of the savannah. He would lift one of his front legs, as if a dog sniffing out prey. But he wasn't smelling or listening for sounds in the air. It was as if he was listening for something coming from the ground below. After a few minutes, as if he had received a signal, he took off in a certain direction. He wasn't wandering aimlessly. His route was purposeful, as if he knew exactly where was he going. And there, several kilometers away, he encountered other elephants. How did he find them? How did he know where they were? This question puzzled Joyce for months. She searched the behavioral literature for an explanation, but found nothing suitable. All sources stated that elephants navigate using their sight, sense of smell, and familiar trails. But Tembo was clearly using a different communication method. The solution came by chance. Joyce read an article about whale songs and came across the name of Dr. Katie Payne, a bioacoustician who studied low-frequency marine mammal communication. The article mentioned that whales emit infrasound, below the level of human hearing, to communicate over long distances. Joyce had a crazy idea. What if elephants also used infrasound? What if the strange buzzing she sometimes felt as they approached wasn't a coincidence, but a means of communication? She wrote a letter to Dr. Payne describing her observations. To her surprise, Katie responded almost immediately and agreed to come to Kenya for joint research. She wrote, "Your observations are consistent with my suspicions. I've long suspected that large land mammals use infrasound to communicate, but no one had ever tested the hypothesis." 3 months later, Katie Payne arrived in Amboseli with a full suite of audio equipment. Special microphones that could record sounds at frequencies as low as 1 Hz, digital spectrum analyzers, and computers to process the data. The equipment cost more than Joyce's 2-year research budget. On their first day of work, they made a discovery that shocked the scientific community. Elephants do communicate, at frequencies between 5 and 20 Hz, below the range of human hearing. Their sounds traveled for tens of kilometers like seismic waves after an earthquake. They had a real language. An ancient, complex, and multifaceted language. In that strange moment of silence, Tembo wasn't just making sounds, he was sending, and he received messages. "I'm here, by the pool of water by the big rocks. Come here, there's lots of good grass here. Danger from the east, gunmen. I found water in the dry riverbed." The other elephants understood and responded. A computer analysis showed that each elephant had a unique signature, a set of frequency characteristics that allowed other elephants to identify the sender of a message. This was similar to the call signal system in radio communication. Moreover, the different types of messages differed in their structure. Distress calls were short and repetitive. Food messages were longer and more rhythmic. Danger warnings were sharp and abrupt. "This isn't just a sound," Dr. Katie Payne wrote in her report. "This is a language. The syntax, the semantics, the grammar, it's all there." Elephants have a communication system that rivals that of primates in complexity. But this was just the beginning of the discoveries that resulted from careful study of Tembo's behavior. Joyce's next discovery came in an experiment inspired by an article about self-awareness in primates. A giant mirror was placed near the watering hole, a specially made large steel mirror, sturdy enough to withstand the curiosity of elephants. Most animals ignore their own reflection or see it as another animal and try to attack or flee. The ability to recognize oneself in a mirror is a sign of strong self-awareness, a trait previously found only in humans, great apes, and dolphins. Tembo responded to the mirror in a very unique way. First, he stood in front of it for a long time, looking at his reflection. Then he began to experiment. He moved his trunk and watched the reflection move. He raised a leg, and the reflection raised a leg. He turned his head, and the reflection turned. This went on for about half an hour. Tembo was trying to understand the relationship between his movements and what was happening in the mirror. Then something amazing happened. Tembo raised his trunk and touched his injured ear, the spot visible only in the reflection. Without the mirror, he wouldn't have been able to see that spot. But somehow he realized that the object in the mirror was himself. He recognized himself, realized he saw his own reflection, not another elephant. Joyce wrote in her diary, "Self-awareness. Tempo not only knows he exists, but he knows who he is. He has a concept of I that is different from not I. This is one of the highest manifestations of intelligence." But that wasn't all. In the days that followed, Tempo continued to use the mirror, but in a different way. He used it as a tool, examining parts of his body he didn't normally see. He checked whether his wounds were healing. He even seemed to admire himself as he turned to face the mirror from different sides. News of this experiment spread quickly through scientific circles. Joyce was invited to conferences, and her articles were published in prestigious journals. But many of her colleagues remained skeptical of her work. "One elephant does not make a scientific theory," said critics. More evidence was needed, and Tempo continued to provide it. The next discoveries, which addressed the emotional realm of elephants, were even more surprising. Joyce began to notice that Tempo not only reacted to events, but also displayed complex emotions previously attributed exclusively to humans. One day she witnessed a scene that forever changed her understanding of elephant psychology. A baby elephant from a neighboring family had fallen into a deep, muddy hole beside a dry riverbed. Its mother was crying out in alarm, but she was too heavy to approach the edge of the hole without collapsing. Tembo heard the screams and came to see what was happening. He studied the situation for a long time, walking around the hole, assessing the depth and texture of the earth. Then he did something incredible. He approached the nearest tree and broke off a thick branch. Not randomly, not in a fit of anger, but deliberately. He chose a branch of the appropriate length and thickness. Then he returned to the hole and methodically began pushing away the mud to create a stable path for the baby elephant. The work took over an hour. Tembo acted like an engineer, calculating every move. When the path was complete, he carefully climbed down into the hole and pulled the frightened calf to the surface with his trunk. He used tools. He planned a multi-stage operation. He showed selflessness toward a calf that was not part of his family. All this was demonstrated by an old African elephant. Official science still considers Tembo merely a smart cow. But what was most striking was the look in Tembo's eyes during this operation. He was focused, determined, and even showed something resembling satisfaction with a job well done. After rescuing the calf, he stood tall, watching the calf's return to its mother. His posture exuded pride in his work. The calf's mother approached Tembo and touched his long trunk, a gesture of gratitude in the elephant world. Tembo reciprocated. They had a silent conversation, filled with emotions almost impossible to describe in human language. This instance became a turning point in Joyce's research. She realized that she was observing not just a highly intelligent animal, but a remarkable being with moral principles. Tembo had saved a calf that wasn't part of his family, not because it served his survival or reproduction, but because he believed it was right. After this incident, Joyce began to study Tembo's problem-solving skills specifically. She developed a series of experiments that required not just strength or good memory, but real thinking as well. The most famous experiment involved reaching for an elusive food item. Joyce hung a fruit high off the ground, far from its trunk. She placed various objects nearby: wooden blocks, car tires, metal boxes. In such a situation, animals either try to jump repeatedly or quickly lose interest and move away. But Tembo's behavior was different. At first, he tried to reach the fruit directly by standing on his hind legs. When he realized this was impossible, he stopped and thought. He literally thought. He stood still and looked first at the fruit, then at the objects around him. His gaze finally rested on a large wooden block placed at some distance. Then occurred what scientists call an insight, a moment of realization. Something changed in Tembo's eyes. He understood. He walked over to the block, carefully rolled it under the dangling fruit, climbed on it, and calmly reached for the fruit. He didn't find the solution by trial and error, but thought carefully. He analyzed the situation, compared the possibilities, and made a decision, like a human solving a puzzle. When Joyce removed the block the next day and replaced it with a car tire, Tembo used it without hesitation. He understood the principle that any stable object of suitable height could serve as a base. This was abstract thinking at its highest. Joyce's colleagues no longer ridiculed their work. Video recordings of Tembo's experiments caused a sensation in the scientific community. Scientists began visiting Amboseli to see this extraordinary elephant with their own eyes. He continued to surprise them with new evidence of his intelligence. It was discovered that Tembo could distinguish between human languages and assess threat levels based on sound. When Joyce played recordings of the voices of the Maasai, who traditionally hunted elephants, Tembo immediately assumed a defensive stance. He pricked up his ears, raised his trunk, and prepared to flee or attack. However, when the voices of the Kikuyu, who lived peacefully with elephants and even worshipped them as sacred animals, rang out, Tembo remained calm. He continued to eat and drink and acted complete. Moreover, he was able to distinguish not only languages, but also tones. The voices of Maasai men caused him great anxiety, while women's voices aroused only mild alertness, and the voices of children did not bother him at all. Tembo realized that only adult male warriors posed a threat, while women and children were safe. This discovery had enormous practical importance. It showed that elephants not only feared all humans equally, but were also capable of accurately distinguishing dangers. They analyzed sound, memorized sound patterns, and used acoustic information to infer people's. Joyce wrote in her report, Tembo doesn't just hear sounds, he analyzes them, discriminates patterns, and makes predictions. This is a higher cognitive activity that requires a well-developed cerebral cortex and the capacity for abstract reasoning. But even more surprising was the discovery of Tembo's artistic abilities. This happened almost by accident when Joyce, inspired by stories about painting monkeys, decided to present the elephant with a brush and paints. She wasn't expecting anything extraordinary, at most, a few messy splashes of paint on the canvas. But Tembo acted completely unexpectedly. He grabbed the brush at the end of his trunk and began drawing patterns. They weren't random strokes, rather thoughtful compositions. His first painting was a series of concentric circles, simple yet surprisingly harmonious. Then he began to experiment with colors, mixing yellow with red, blue with green. When Joyce played music, his movements became rhythmic and synchronized with the melody. Most surprising, Tembo seemed to enjoy painting. He spent a long time studying his works, sometimes returning to unfinished pieces to add new details. He had a sense of composition, an understanding of color combinations, even a semblance of artistic style. Studies have shown that elephants can distinguish 12 notes of the musical scale and retain simple melodies for up to a year and a half. Tembo didn't just respond to music as sounds, he sensed its rhythm, harmony, and emotional mood. When fast music was played, he would start swaying rhythmically, like a dancer. Slower, sad tunes would make him freeze and lower his head, as if crying to the music. Classical pieces elicited a special response in him, as he would freeze in rapt listening, sometimes nodding his head in time with the music. Joyce wrote, "Timbo has an aesthetic sense. He not only perceives beauty, but is capable of creating it. This suggests a highly sophisticated development of the nervous system, possessing the same brain structures responsible for creativity in humans." But the real breakthrough came with understanding the complexity of elephant communication. Months of observation of Timbo and his family revealed that elephants have more sophisticated means of communication than just danger signals or food calls. Each elephant in a herd has a unique call that others use to address it. Joyce recorded a mother elephant calling her calf from among a group of youngsters playing, and only the calf responded. It wasn't a generic call like, "Hey kids, come here," but a personalized greeting like, "Jumbo, come to mummy." A computer analysis of the sounds revealed that each elephant has a set of unique frequency characteristics, a kind of vocal fingerprint, which relatives can easily distinguish even from several kilometers away. This allows them to maintain personal relationships in large herds of dozens of individuals. Moreover, elephants use different vocal tones to express different emotions: joy, sadness, fear, curiosity. Each situation has its own vocal characteristics. Tembo could say the same message, for example, "Come here," in 10 different ways, each conveying additional information about the urgency of the situation, the emotional state, or the degree of danger. They pass on their knowledge from generation to generation, creating authentic cultural traditions. Older female elephants teach their younger counterparts where to find water during the dry season, how to avoid dangerous places, how to care for their young, and how to behave around humans. This knowledge is not genetically programmed, but is acquired through learning and practice. Joyce observed a seasoned mother elephant teaching her young female elephants the proper use of medicinal plants. They chewed certain leaves to treat indigestion, the bark of some trees helped fight parasites, and other roots were used to treat infections. This was genuine folk medicine, passed down from master to student. Even more astonishing, elephants are capable of cooperation on par with higher primates. Joyce devised a special experiment. 2 elephants had to pull on both ends of a rope simultaneously to receive a reward. If only one person pulled, the system wouldn't work. It required a combined effort. Tembo and his partner quickly grasped the rules of the game. Moreover, they demonstrated an understanding of the importance of synchronization. If his partner was delayed, Tembo would wait patiently for up to 45 seconds without attempting to pull the rope alone. This demonstrated an understanding of teamwork principles and an ability to suppress impulsive urges in favor of a common goal. While this task seems simple to humans, it can be difficult for most animals. When similar tests were conducted with crows and their relatives, which, as research increasingly shows, are exceptionally intelligent, they found that crows were smarter than other animals. They never waited for their mate. In the wild, Joyce noticed more complex examples of cooperation. Elephants can organize a rescue of a calf in distress, coordinate defense against predators, and jointly solve problems related to finding water and food. All of this requires planning, role sharing, and mutual understanding, traits once considered the exclusive domain of humans. However, the most striking evidence of Tembo's intelligence came in a 1989 story that forever changed human perceptions of elephant morality. That year, an unusually violent wildfire swept through the savanna. The drought had lasted for months. Vegetation was dying, and a tiny spark from a lightning strike instantly transformed into a fiery catastrophe. The flames spread with the speed of the wind, consuming everything in their path. Joyce and her team were ordered to evacuate immediately. The fire was approaching their camp, and remaining there was life-threatening. She gathered her most valuable gear, loaded it into the jeep, and prepared to leave. She looked out at the savanna one last time, expecting to see herds of animals fleeing the fire. But Tembo did not flee. Instead, he moved toward the fire. Joyce couldn't believe her eyes. The elephant went to the nearest watering hole, filled his trunk with as much water as he could, about 10 liters, and poured it methodically onto the burning bushes. This wasn't the chaotic action of a frightened animal. It was a calculated firefighting strategy. Tembo chose the most dangerous spots, areas where the flames could spread to larger trees or to areas where other elephants graze. He acted like a professional firefighter. The water in his trunk quickly ran out, and Tembo kept heading back to the watering hole. The path between the water and the fire was several hundred meters long, but he ran through the smoke and heat. The fire scorched the tip of his trunk, but he didn't back down. Joyce was impressed not only by the elephant's ability to put out the fire, but also by the understanding behind his actions. Tembo understood the relationship between cause and effect. Water extinguishes fire. Fire threatens the forest, and the forest is home to many living creatures, including elephants. He made the ethical decision to risk his safety to save his habitat. This incident led to an astonishing discovery. After a careful study of similar cases around the world, it was discovered that elephants in Indonesia have long been used to fight forest fires, specially trained to work with water pumps and hoses. These firefighting elephants have proven incredibly effective in extinguishing fires in hard-to-reach areas. But Tembo was untrained. He figured out what to do on his own and decided to take action. This was an expression of what philosophers call moral judgment, the ability to distinguish between right and wrong and act according to that understanding. After this incident, news of Tembo spread beyond scientific circles. Newspapers wrote about him. Documentaries were produced, and he appeared on popular science programs. He became a symbol of the rationality of the animal world and living proof that intelligence and morality are not purely human traits. However, the most famous discovery associated with Tembo was yet to come, which forever changed people's view of elephants. In 1995, Joyce received a grant to research elephant translocation, a topic that had grown in importance due to the need to move animals between zoos and nature reserves for breeding programs. Translocation gained importance. When Tembo needed to be transported from one reserve to another, Joyce decided to conduct an unusual experiment. The problem with transporting elephants by plane was that these giants could panic in a confined space and wander around the cage, upsetting the plane's balance. This could even lead to a plane crash. Normally, elephants had to be sedated during flight, but this was dangerous to their health. Joyce developed an alternative solution based on her understanding of elephant psychology. She placed dozens of baby elephants, yellow, fluffy, and incredibly fragile creatures, in Tembo's cage. The logic was simple. Through extensive research, Joyce was absolutely certain that elephants have a strong sense of empathy and an instinct to protect the weakest. If Tembo saw defenseless creatures nearby, he would react with extreme caution, avoiding harming them. The result exceeded all expectations. When Tembo saw the chicks, he froze. This 5-ton behemoth, capable of wiping out everything with a single swipe of his tail, stood motionless throughout the 8-hour flight from one sanctuary to another. Pilots reported that the flight was unusually smooth. Transporting large animals is usually associated with vibrations, shifts in the center of gravity, and balance problems. But with Tembo, everything was different. Even when the plane entered an area of severe turbulence and passengers were tossed here and there, the elephant managed to maintain his balance and avoid any rash movement. A flight attendant looking into the cargo hold later told an incredible story. Tembo stood with his trunk raised, watching each chick intently. When one got too close to his feet, the elephant gently nudged it to safety. When another chick cried out in fear during the turbulence, Tembo leaned. Compassion for helpless creatures was stronger than the instinct for self-preservation. The fear of flying, the pressure of the confined space, and the physical discomfort faded into the background in the face of the need to protect the chicks. That day, the entire flight crew realized they were transporting not just a giant animal, but an individual with a strong value system, a being capable of sacrificing itself for others and putting its own needs aside for higher principles. The chick's story spread throughout the world and became a turning point in the public's perception of elephants. Video footage of the experiment was shown on television in every country. Images of the giant elephant, standing cautiously among the tiny yellow chicks, appeared on magazine covers and became a symbol of interspecies compassion. However, Global recognition of Tembo and Joyce's discoveries did not come until the events of December 26, 2004, the day that elephants saved thousands of people from a horrific disaster. On that fateful morning, the Indian Ocean coast looked idyllic. Tourists from all over the world were enjoying the tropical paradises of Thailand and Sri Lanka. And the white beaches of India looked like the epitome of tranquility. 8-year-old British girl Amber Mason was riding an elephant named Ning Nong on a resort beach on the island of Phuket. It was a perfectly ordinary holiday day. Sun, sea, and exotic activities that would be remembered for a lifetime. But at around 4 o'clock a.m., something monstrous happened deep in the Indian Ocean. Off the coast of Sumatra, 30 kilometers down, tectonic plates shifted, triggering an underwater earthquake measuring 9.0 on the Richter scale, one of the most powerful earthquakes in human history. The energy released was equivalent to the explosion of 23,000 atomic bombs. But the people on the beaches had no idea. Nothing like this. The underwater earthquake occurred 2,000 kilometers away, and none of the vacationers felt it. They continued to sunbathe, swim in the clear water, and plan their daily excursions. But the elephants knew all about it. Along the coast, the animals began behaving strangely long before the first waves hit the shore. In Thailand, in the Khao Lak region, elephant owner Jongkrit Kheosawan was awakened at 4 a.m. by terrifying sounds. His 8 elephants let out cries he had never heard in 20 years of working with them. It sounded like crying, he later told reporters. Not like the usual elephant trumpet sounds, but something very sad and disturbing, as if they were mourning a tragedy that had yet to occur. And the elephants tore at the chains that had bound them at night. The heavy-bearing metal ties snapped like string. The animals ran up the slope, emitting shrill warning cries. Those who had lived with elephants all their lives and understood their behavior accompanied them. On Patong Beach, Elephant Ning Nong sensed with all her being that disaster was imminent. She had been carrying tourists for half an hour when she suddenly became alarmed. She raised her trunk, smelled something invisible, and shifted from one foot to the other. Her keeper, Dan, who had worked with elephants for 10 years, had never seen Ning Nong in such a state. Little Amber, perched on the elephant's back, sensed the animal's tension. "Something's wrong," she said to her parents, who were watching from the shore. Then something strange happened. The sea suddenly receded. The water receded hundreds of meters from the shore, revealing the seabed, which was covered with fish, coral, and algae. The tourists were amazed by this unprecedented sight. Many ran toward the waterline, unaware that this was a sign of impending disaster. But the elephant understood. Ning Nong turned and quickly ran away from the sea, still carrying the little girl on her back, forcing the girl's guide and family to run in the same direction. Not only did the animal escape, but it saved lives. Minutes later, from the safety of higher ground, everyone watched in horror as a massive wave crashed onto the beach, sweeping everything away. How did the elephants know of the impending disaster? Michael Garstang, a scientist at the University of Virginia, believes that elephants in Thailand responded to the sound of crashing waves in the distance along the Sumatra coast. At the same time, about 20 minutes before the tsunami struck, they heard the strange sound of water receding along the beach. They also noticed the peculiar smell of the exposed seabed. Studies of acoustic and seismic communications show that elephants can easily sense the vibrations caused by massive earthquakes and tsunamis. Joyce Poole witnessed this firsthand. "I was with elephants during 2 small earthquakes, and in both cases, the elephants fled in panic just seconds before I felt the shaking." This was Tembo's way of warning us of an impending natural disaster. By the late 1990s, Tembo had become the most studied elephant in the world. His story spread around the world and changed people's perceptions of animal intelligence. Documentaries about him have been shown on all continents, and school children have learned about his abilities. Scientists from all over the world flocked to Amboseli to see the legendary elephant with their own eyes, but years of poaching, drought, and human interference took their toll. In 2003, when Tembo was about 45 years old, Joyce noticed that he had slowed down. Old wounds from previous encounters with poachers ached in the cold nights. His eyesight was deteriorating, but his mind remained as sharp as ever. Even in his old age, Tembo continued to display a prodigious intelligence. He devised new ways to use tools, learned to pick complex locks, and continued to paint. Now his artwork was more abstract, as if to reflect the depth of his life. On the morning of February 18, 2006, Joyce found Tembo lying under his favorite acacia tree. He had passed peacefully in his sleep, a wise old man. He was about 48, a respectable age for a wild elephant. But Tembo's death did not end his story. Rather, it was the beginning of a new chapter in humanity's understanding of animal intelligence. The elephant family came to say goodbye to Tembo. They performed the same burial rituals that Joyce had first witnessed 24 years earlier. They covered his body with dirt. They touched it with their trunks. They stood in silence and mourned. Even elephants from neighboring areas came to pay their respects to the patriarch who had changed the way humans viewed their species. By the time Tembo died, the world had already changed forever. Thanks to this amazing elephant and Joyce Ball's research, the scientific community realized that elephants possess the following characteristics. Self-awareness. They recognize themselves in a mirror, complex emotions, sadness, joy, compassion, and even a sense of justice, and a highly developed communication system, a sub-language with rules and grammar, the capacity for abstract reasoning, planning, problem-solving, and the use of tools. Cultural traditions, knowledge passed down from generation to generation. Moral principles. Altruism, protection of the weak, and a sense of duty. Elephants were no longer seen simply as smart cows. They were recognized for what they were, always on them. Intelligent beings with rich inner lives, deserving of respect and protection. Research that began with simple observations of an injured elephant in the Kenyan savannah revolutionized zoology, animal psychology, and conservation. Joyce Ball's work is cited in thousands of scientific articles. Methods for studying elephant intelligence are now applied to other animal species. Thanks to Tembo, laws protecting elephants worldwide have changed. The ivory trade has been banned in most countries.
New protected areas have been established.
Programs to mitigate human-elephant conflict have been built on understanding the psychology of these animals, rather than coercion. However, the most significant change has occurred in people's minds. What began as a young scientist's dissertation on the reproductive behavior of elephants has become one of the greatest discoveries in the history of ethology. Today, years after Tembo's death, his story continues to inspire new generations of researchers. A memorial to Tembo is erected in Amboseli, a simple stone tablet engraved with an elephant and the inscription, Tembo, the teacher who showed us that intelligence has many forms. Joyce Poole, now in her 70s, continues to work with elephants. She has founded several organizations to protect these animals and written several books about elephant intelligence. Her work forms the basis of modern elephant conservation programs around the world. A bronze statue of Tembo stands in a small museum in Amboseli. Inscribed on the plaque are Joyce Poole's words. Tembo taught us that intelligence has many forms. Intelligence and emotions are not exclusively human traits. They are different, expressions of a single phenomenon of consciousness that connects all thinking beings on our planet. Beside it hangs a photograph, a young scientist in a battered jeep with a massive elephant resting peacefully beside him. Their positions, two intelligent beings who met across the gap of species differences and changed the world. Tembo's story is one of the lessons nature can teach us if we are willing to listen. It is a story about how wisdom, it knows no boundaries between species. It's a story that we are not alone in this world. Other forms of intelligence surround us, waiting for our appreciation and respect. And somewhere in the African savannah, a new generation of elephants is passing on their ancient knowledge to their young, preserving the memory of the great Tembo, the elephant who proved to the world that animals have souls.